The scorching August sun blistered the dusty streets of Hachita, New Mexico Territory, 1883, as Benjamin Dawson rode into town, his shadow stretching long and thin across the parched earth. The former Texas Ranger had chased outlaws across 3 territories, but nothing prepared him for the sight that stopped him cold at the edge of town, a slender woman with copper hair being pelted with stones by a group of jeering townsfolk. "Witch," someone shouted. "Devil woman," cried another, as a rock struck her shoulder. Ben's hand moved instinctively to the worn Colt at his hip. He didn't draw, but the motion was enough to make his gelding stomp nervously as he nudged the horse forward. The crowd scattered as he approached, his reputation having preceded him to this remote mining town nestled against the foothills of the Little Hatchet Mountains. "That's enough," he called, his voice carrying the weight of authority that came from years of wearing a badge. The townsfolk fell silent, though hatred still burned in their eyes as they regarded the woman cowering against the wall of the general store. She stood tall despite her circumstances, chin lifted in defiance even as blood trickled from a cut above her eye. Her dress, once fine but now tattered, hung from her slender frame like a faded memory of better days. "This don't concern you, mister," a burly man with a blacksmith's apron said, stepping forward. "Grace Renfield ain't welcome here, been nothing but trouble since she arrived." Ben dismounted slowly, deliberately. At 6'2", with shoulders broadened by years of hard riding, he cut an imposing figure. "Seems to me 7 against 1 ain't particularly sporting," he remarked, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "What's her crime?" "She brings death," hissed an old woman from the back of the crowd. "3 men dead since she came to Hachita. Her husband first, then Miller's boy, then old Doc Hayes." The woman Grace finally spoke, her voice surprisingly strong despite her predicament. "I nursed them as best I could. The fever took them, not me." "Fever, she says," scoffed the blacksmith. "More like witchcraft. No natural fever acts so quick." Ben looked at Grace more carefully. Her green eyes held no madness, only exhaustion and a flicker of something else: intelligence, determination. He'd seen enough guilty faces in his time to recognize innocence when he saw it. "Where I come from," Ben said casually, "we don't condemn folks without evidence." His hand still rested near his gun, a silent reminder of the consequences of hasty action. "Reverend Hollis says," began a woman in a high-necked dress. "Reverend Hollis ain't judge and jury," Ben interrupted. "Now clear out, all of you, show's over." The crowd dispersed reluctantly, muttering threats and casting baleful glances back at Grace. The blacksmith was the last to leave, pointing a thick finger at Ben. "You'll regret helping her, stranger. Mark my words." When they were alone, Grace straightened her dress with as much dignity as she could muster. "Thank you, but your kindness will cost you," she said. "This town has a long memory for grievances and a short one for facts." "Wouldn't be the first time I've found myself unwelcome," Ben replied, offering his bandana for her bleeding forehead. "Benjamin Dawson." She hesitated before taking the cloth. "Grace Renfield, widow." "You got somewhere safe to stay, Mrs. Renfield," a bitter laugh escaped her lips. "I have a cabin. Not that safe is a word I'd use. They burned my garden last week." She gestured to the edge of town. "It's just past the creek." Ben retrieved his horse's reins. "I'll walk you home." "That's not necessary. It wasn't an offer, madam," he said, his tone brooking no argument. "Where I come from, we don't leave people to fend off angry mobs alone." Grace studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "As you wish, Mr. Dawson." They walked in silence, Ben leading his horse, Grace keeping a careful distance from both. The townsfolk watched from windows and doorways, their hostility palpable in the heavy summer air. "You shouldn't stay in Hachita," Ben finally said as they approached a small, weathered cabin set apart from the town proper. "I have nowhere else to go," Grace replied simply. "My husband brought me here from St. Louis after we married. We were going to build a life." She paused, her eyes focusing on something distant. Then the fever came. Ben tied his horse to a post and surveyed the property. The cabin was modest but solid, though the garden had indeed been reduced to charred earth. A small stream gurgled nearby and the mountains rose in the distance, purple against the fading sky. "What happened?" he asked. Grace unlocked her door, stepping inside before answering. "My husband fell ill first. I tried everything I knew: cold compresses, willow bark tea. He died within days. Then others began showing the same symptoms. I offered to help, having some training as a nurse. Some accepted out of desperation." She placed the bloodied bandana on a small wooden table. "When they died anyway, people needed someone to blame." The interior of the cabin was neat but spartan: a bed, a table with 2 chairs, a small stove and shelves lined with books, an unusual sight in a frontier town. A collection of dried herbs hung from the rafters and a medical bag sat open on a side table. "You're a doctor?" Ben asked, surprised. "No," Grace said with a small, sad smile. "My father was. I assisted him until he deemed it improper for a young lady to continue. Then he arranged my marriage to James instead." Ben nodded thoughtfully. "These fevers, they still going around?" "No, whatever it was passed as quickly as it came." She gestured to her face. "But the blame remains." Ben removed his hat, running a hand through his dark hair. "I'm looking for work, tracking mostly, but I can turn my hand to most anything. Been a ranger, a bounty hunter, even tried ranching for a spell." Grace arched an eyebrow. "Are you offering to help me, Mr. Dawson? Because I warn you, association with the Witch of Hachita isn't good for one's health or reputation." "Wouldn't be offering if I was concerned with either," Ben replied. "Besides, I've faced worse than superstitious townsfolk. Comanche Apaches, outlaws who'd shoot a man for his boots." For the first time, a genuine smile briefly touched Grace's lips. "Very well, I could use help rebuilding my garden. I sell herbs and remedies, or I did before." She trailed off. "Before they decided you were a witch," Ben finished for her. "I'll be back tomorrow then. For now, keep your door locked." As Ben turned to leave, Grace called after him. "Why are you helping me? You don't know me." Ben paused in the doorway. "My ma always said, judge a town by how it treats its most vulnerable. Seems to me Hachita's showing its true colors." With that, he settled his hat back on his head and untied his horse, aware of the eyes watching from the distance, feeling the weight of a decision that would change the course of 2 lives forever. The next morning, Ben returned to Grace's cabin as promised, his saddlebags filled with seeds and tools purchased from a reluctant shopkeeper in town. The man had warned him again about associating with that woman, but Ben's cold stare and the gold coin he'd placed on the counter had silenced further protest. Grace opened her door cautiously at his knock, surprise evident in her eyes when she saw the supplies. "You actually came back." "Said I would, didn't I?" Ben replied, stepping past her into the cabin. He noticed she'd cleaned and bandaged the cut on her forehead, but a purplish bruise had bloomed around it overnight. "Most people in Hachita don't keep their word where I'm concerned," she said, following his gaze to the battered tin mirror on her wall. "It looks worse than it feels." Ben set down his purchases on the table. "Got seeds for vegetables, some herbs I recognized from what you had drying. Fellow at the store wasn't keen on selling to me once he knew where I was headed, but money talks louder than gossip." Grace sorted through the packets with expert hands, her expression softening. "This is very generous. I'll repay you when I can." "We'll work something out," Ben said. "Thought we'd start with clearing what's left of the old garden, then till the soil fresh." They spent the morning working side by side under the unrelenting New Mexico sun. Ben removed the charred remains of Grace's previous plants while she prepared the soil, her knowledge of growing conditions impressive to a man who'd spent most of his life on the move. "You know your plants," he commented as she meticulously arranged the seed packets according to some system only she understood. "My mother taught me before she died," Grace explained, not looking up from her work. "She was a healer in her own right, though without formal training. The knowledge was passed down through generations of women in her family." Ben wiped sweat from his brow. That why folks are so quick to cry, which Grace's hands stilled. Partly, being educated doesn't help either. Women aren't supposed to have opinions or knowledge beyond keeping house. A bitter edge crept into her voice. And when men die despite your best efforts to save them, well, it must be the devil's work. People fear what they don't understand, Ben said, driving his shovel into the earth with more force than necessary. Seen it with Indians, seen it with foreigners, seen it with women who step outside what men think is proper. They worked in companionable silence until midday, when Grace went inside and returned with a pitcher of water and 2 tin cups. As they sat in the shade of the cabin to rest, a rider approached from town. Ben's hand moved instinctively to his gun. Sheriff Ellis, Grace identified the approaching man, tension evident in her posture. The sheriff was a weathered man in his 50s, his badge polished to a shine that contrasted with his dusty clothes. He reined in his horse and tipped his hat. "Mrs. Renfield, heard we had a new visitor in town," he said, eyeing Ben carefully. "Benjamin Dawson," Ben introduced himself, rising to his feet but keeping his distance. "Dawson," the sheriff repeated, recognition flickering in his eyes. "Texas Ranger, if I recall correctly, quite the reputation." "Former Ranger," Ben corrected, "just passing through." Sheriff Ellis nodded slowly. "Well, Mr. Dawson, might want to be careful about the company you keep in Hachita. Some folks aren't as welcome as others." "Noticed that yesterday," Ben replied evenly. "Also noticed law enforcement was nowhere to be found when a mob was stoning a lone woman." The sheriff's face hardened. "I maintain peace in this town as best I can. Sometimes that means letting folks work out their differences without interference." "Interesting definition of peace," Ben observed. Ellis ignored the comment, turning to Grace. "Mrs. Renfield, Reverend Hollies is holding a special service tomorrow. Thinks it might be beneficial if you attended. Clear the air, so to speak." Grace's expression remained carefully neutral. "Please thank the Reverend for his concern, but I have work to do here." "Might help your standing in town," Ellis persisted. "I doubt that very much," she replied coolly. The sheriff shrugged. "Suit yourself." He gathered his reins. "Dawson Hotel has rooms if you're planning to stay. Good day to you both." As Ellis rode away, Ben watched Grace, noting how her shoulders slumped slightly once the man was out of sight. "That happen often. Official visits suggesting you conform, often enough," she acknowledged. "Sheriff Ellis isn't as hostile as some, but he makes it clear where his sympathies lie." They resumed their work, finishing the garden preparation by late afternoon. Ben helped Grace draw water from the creek to give the newly planted seeds a good start, aware that several townsfolk had ridden by during the day, ostensibly on legitimate business but clearly monitoring their activities. "You should go," Grace said as the sun began to set. "Being seen helping me all day is bad enough. If you're here after dark, they'll start a different kind of rumor." Ben met her gaze steadily. "I've never much cared what people say about me." "Nevertheless," she insisted. "I've imposed on your kindness enough for one day." Recognizing the dismissal, Ben nodded. "I'll check the hotel then. Be back tomorrow to help with that fence." Grace looked surprised. "You don't have to, I know I don't," he interrupted. "I want to, unless you'd rather I didn't come back." Something flickered across her face, hope perhaps, or fear of hope. "No, your help is welcome, thank you." As Ben rode toward town in the gathering dusk, he reflected on the woman he'd spent the day with. Grace Renfield was unlike anyone he'd encountered in his travels, educated, resilient, and possessed of a quiet dignity despite her circumstances. Her isolation had clearly been difficult, yet she'd carved out a life for herself in the face of tremendous hostility. The Miners' Rest Hotel stood at the center of Hachita, a 2-story structure that had seen better days but remained the only lodging establishment in town. Ben secured a room for the week, ignoring the clerk's pointed comments about his activities that day. After stabling his horse, he made his way to the saloon, knowing that information flowed freely with whiskey. The conversation stopped briefly when he entered, then resumed at a lower volume. Ben ordered a drink and found a corner table back to the wall where he could observe the room. It didn't take long for curiosity to overcome hostility. A man in miner's clothes approached, cap in hand. "You're the fella helped the widow Renfield today." Ben nodded, taking a measured sip of his whiskey. "Might want to reconsider that association," the miner continued. "Woman's bad luck." "Heard that," Ben replied. "Also heard she tried to save people who were sick. Where I come from, we call that compassion, not witchcraft." The man glanced nervously over his shoulder. "Just saying, 3 men dead in 2 months, all after she treated them. Coincidence?" "Or a sickness she couldn't cure," Ben countered. "You a doctor?" "No, but then maybe you're not qualified to say what killed those men." Ben's tone remained conversational, but his eyes had hardened. "Seems to me a woman trying to help deserves gratitude, not stones." The miner backed away, muttering under his breath. Ben finished his drink in solitude, gathering snippets of conversation from around the room. The prevailing sentiment matched what he'd already heard: fear and suspicion of the woman who lived alone, who had knowledge beyond her station, who had tried and failed to save lives. Later, as he settled into his hotel room, Ben pondered the situation. Grace Renfield clearly needed an ally, but his help would likely only antagonize the town further. Yet something about her courage in the face of such hostility resonated with him. He'd spent years enforcing the law, but true justice was a rarer commodity than he cared to admit. Before sleep claimed him, he made a decision. He would stay in Hachita for a time, help Grace rebuild what had been destroyed, and perhaps in the process discover the truth behind the deaths that had turned a town against one woman. The following weeks established a pattern. Ben would arrive at Grace's cabin early each morning, help with whatever tasks needed doing, and return to town by nightfall. They rebuilt the garden fence, repaired the cabin roof, and constructed a small greenhouse using salvaged glass from the abandoned mine offices. Through their daily work, Ben learned more about the remarkable woman he defended on instinct. Grace had been raised in St. Louis by her physician father after her mother's death. She'd received an education unusual for a woman, studying literature, mathematics, and the rudiments of medicine by assisting her father. Her marriage to James Renfield, a mining engineer seeking fortune in the territories, had brought her to Hachita a year earlier. When James died of the mysterious fever, Grace found herself alone in a hostile environment, her education and independence marking her as suspicious in the eyes of the superstitious townsfolk. "Why stay?" Ben asked one afternoon as they harvested the first vegetables from the revitalized garden. "You could start fresh somewhere else." Grace carefully placed a tomato in her basket. "I've asked myself that many times, pride perhaps, or stubbornness." She straightened, pushing a strand of copper hair back under her bonnet. "James is buried here, and running feels like admitting guilt." Ben nodded, understanding the sentiment all too well. "Still, there's no shame in seeking peace." "Is that what you're seeking, Benjamin Dawson?" she asked, her green eyes studying him intently. "You never speak of your past or what brought you to Hachita." He focused on pulling a weed before answering. "Been drifting since the Rangers. Some things happened, bad things that made wearing the badge feel false." He didn't elaborate, and Grace didn't press. Instead, she surprised him by placing her hand briefly on his arm. "Thank you. Not just for the help, but for believing me when no one else would." The simple touch sent an unexpected warmth through him. In the weeks they'd worked together, they'd developed an easy companionship, but physical contact had been minimal, both maintaining a careful distance. This small gesture of gratitude crossed an invisible boundary. "People are starting to talk about you too, you know," Grace said, withdrawing her hand. "The cowboy who defends the witch. It can't be good for your reputation." Ben shrugged. "Let them talk. Words don't bother me much." "It's not just words I'm worried about," she admitted. "Reverend Hollis has been preaching more vehemently against me. Yesterday, Mrs. Peterson refused to sell me flour, said she wouldn't have my tainted money." Grace sighed. "And now they're extending that treatment to you." Before Ben could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. 3 riders appeared on the road from town, and Grace tensed visibly as she recognized them. "Reverend Hollies," she murmured, "with Edward Miller and Thomas Burke." Ben recognized Miller as the blacksmith from their first encounter. Burke he knew as the owner of the largest saloon in Hachita, a man with considerable influence in the small community. The 3 men dismounted at the edge of the property. Reverend Hollies, a tall, gaunt man with piercing eyes, stepped forward. "Mrs. Renfield," he called, "we've come to speak with you." Grace set down her basket and moved to meet them, Ben close behind her. "Gentlemen," she acknowledged coolly, "this is unexpected." "Not entirely, I think," Hollies replied. "You must have known we couldn't allow this situation to continue indefinitely." "And what situation is that, Reverend?" Ben asked, his voice deceptively calm. Hollies regarded Ben with thinly veiled disdain. "Mr. Dawson. Your interference in town matters is most unwelcome." Miller, the blacksmith, was less diplomatic. "We want you gone, woman," he growled. "You and your pet gunslinger both." Grace stood her ground. "This is my property, legally purchased and paid for. I have done nothing wrong." "My son died after you treated him," Miller spat. "That's wrong enough." "I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Miller," Grace replied evenly, "but I did everything possible to save Robert. The fever was too strong." Burke, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. "The town council met last night. We've decided it's in everyone's best interest if you sell your property and leave Hachita." "And if I refuse?" Grace asked, though she clearly knew the answer. Reverend Hollies spread his hands in a gesture of false regret. "Then we cannot guarantee your safety." "Or Mr. Dawson's. Accidents happen in mining towns." Ben's hand moved to his gun. "That sounds like a threat, Reverend. Doesn't seem very Christian." "Sometimes the Lord's work requires unpleasant actions," Hollies replied smoothly. "We're offering fair compensation for the property." "It's not for sale," Grace stated firmly. The 3 men exchanged glances. Burke nodded to Miller, who reached into his coat and withdrew an envelope. "This is our offer. Consider it carefully, Mrs. Renfield. You have 3 days." He thrust the envelope at Grace, who took it without opening it. "Good day, gentlemen," she said dismissively. As the men remounted their horses, Hollies paused. "Mr. Dawson, I understand you're a man with a past. Perhaps you should consider whether protecting a suspected witch is worth risking your own standing or safety." After they'd ridden away, Grace opened the envelope with trembling hands. "They're offering half what the property is worth," she said bitterly. "They expect me to be desperate enough to accept." Ben watched the riders disappear toward town. "Are you?" Grace turned to face him, her expression resolute. "No, this is my home. I won't be driven out by fear and ignorance." She hesitated. "But you should consider what the Reverend said. Your reputation, my reputation, can withstand a few rumors," Ben interrupted. "But those weren't just threats. They're planning something." Grace's brave facade cracked slightly. "I know. They've been building to this for months. First social isolation, then economic pressure, now threats." She took a deep breath. "Benjamin, I appreciate everything you've done, but this isn't your fight." "It became my fight when I saw them stoning you in the street," he replied firmly. "I don't abandon people who need help." Their eyes met, and something shifted between them, an acknowledgement of deeper feelings that had been growing during their weeks together, feelings neither had dared to name. The moment was broken by a distant rumble of thunder. Dark clouds were gathering over the mountains, promising a rare summer storm. "We should get the rest of these vegetables in," Grace said, turning back to her garden. "Rain's coming." As they worked to harvest what they could before the storm, Ben formulated a plan. He would need to ride to Silver City, the county seat, to speak with the territorial marshal. The threats against Grace constituted criminal intimidation, and while the local sheriff might turn a blind eye, federal authorities might take a different view. The storm broke just as they finished, fat raindrops pelting the dry earth as they carried the last baskets into the cabin. They were both soaked by the time they got inside, and Grace quickly lit the stove to ward off the sudden chill. "You should wait out the worst of it," she said, handing Ben a towel for his dripping hair. "Streams flood quickly around here." Ben accepted the towel, acutely aware that this was the first time circumstances had kept him in the cabin past sundown. The small space seemed even smaller with both of them inside, the rain drumming on the roof creating a strange intimacy. "I need to go to Silver City tomorrow," he said as Grace stoked the fire. "Speak to the marshal about what's happening here." She turned to face him, surprise evident in her expression. "You think the marshal will intervene?" "Worth trying," Ben replied. "These men are threatening violence." "That's beyond local disputes," Grace shook her head. "You don't understand how deep this goes. The fear, the superstition, it's not just Hollis and his followers. Most of the town believes I'm responsible for those deaths." "Then they need to hear the truth," Ben insisted. "What exactly happened when those men fell ill?" Grace sank into a chair, suddenly looking exhausted. "It started with James. High fever, delirium, spots on the skin. He was dead within 4 days. Then Robert Miller showed symptoms, and his father reluctantly allowed me to try to help, as the town doctor had died months before and no replacement had arrived." She twisted her hands in her lap. "Robert died too, despite everything I did. And then Doc Hayes, he was retired but came to assist when he heard about the outbreak. He contracted it while we were treating a third case that recovered." "And no one else fell ill after that?" Ben asked. "No, whatever it was burned through quickly, but 3 dead men was enough. People started whispering that I'd brought some curse or evil with me from the east." Grace looked up at Ben. "The rational explanation is some disease that ran its course, but people prefer the explanation that gives them someone to blame." Ben paced the small room, thinking. "Were there any common factors? Something all 3 men came in contact with?" Grace frowned, considering. "They all worked at the mine at some point. James was an engineer, Robert a laborer, and Doc Hayes had treated injuries there." Her eyes widened slightly. "You think the illness came from the mine?" "It's possible," Ben said. "Miners get all sorts of sicknesses from dust and gases. And who owns the largest stake in the mine?" "Thomas Burke," Grace replied slowly, "with Reverend Hollis as a significant investor." The implications hung in the air between them. If the mine was the source of the deadly illness, those with financial interests might prefer a scapegoat to a proper investigation that could shut down operations. The storm intensified, rain lashing against the windows as lightning illuminated the small cabin in brief, harsh flashes. Grace rose to prepare a simple meal, and they ate together at her small table, discussing possibilities and planning Ben's trip to Silver City. As night fell and the storm showed no signs of abating, an awkward reality presented itself. "You can't ride back to town in this," Grace said, glancing at the window where water now streamed steadily. "The creek will be over its banks." Ben nodded, equally aware of the impropriety of staying and the danger of leaving. "I can sleep in the chair," he offered. Grace's cheeks colored slightly. "There's no need for that. I have a pallet I can set up." Despite her protests, Ben insisted on taking the pallet while Grace kept her bed. As they prepared for sleep, the strange intimacy of sharing such close quarters with a woman he'd come to admire deeply was not lost on him. In the darkness, with only the sound of rain between them, Grace spoke softly. "Why did you really stop that day, Benjamin, when they were stoning me? You could have ridden past like everyone else." Ben considered his answer carefully. "I've seen too much injustice in my life, done things I'm not proud of in the name of the law. Maybe I'm trying to balance the scales." A pause, then. "What happened with the Rangers?" Ben stared at the ceiling, memories he usually kept at bay flooding back. "There was a settlement of Comanche. Women, children, old men, mostly the warriors, were away. My captain ordered us to attack anyway, called it preventative action." His voice grew tight. "I refused. Some of the others followed my lead, but most didn't. 17 people died that day, including 5 children. That's why you left." Grace asked softly. That and what came after, Ben replied. Captain made sure I was blamed for insubordination, painted me as sympathetic to raiders. By the time the dust settled, my reputation was in tatters and wearing the badge felt like a lie. Grace was silent for so long that Ben thought she might have fallen asleep. Then she said, "We're both outcasts in our way. Perhaps that's why you understood when no one else would." Perhaps, Ben agreed, though he knew it was more than that. In the weeks since he'd first seen Grace standing defiant against her accusers, his admiration had deepened into something more complex, more powerful. "Thank you for staying," Grace whispered. "Not just tonight, but all these weeks." "I'm not going anywhere," Ben promised, the words carrying more meaning than he'd intended. In the darkness, neither could see the other's expression, but something fundamental had changed between them, a trust established, a connection acknowledged. As sleep finally claimed them, the storm continued to rage outside, a fitting backdrop to the turbulence that awaited them in the days to come. Morning brought clear skies and the aftermath of the storm, mud, debris, and a creek swollen beyond its banks. Ben surveyed the damage from Grace's porch, noting that the garden had survived mostly intact thanks to the drainage trenches they'd dug. "The road to Silver City will be impassable for a day or two," Grace observed, joining him with a cup of coffee. Ben nodded, accepting the cup. "Gives us time to prepare. Once I go to the marshal, things are likely to escalate quickly." Grace's expression grew troubled. "I've been thinking about what we discussed last night about the mine possibly being the source of the illness. If that's true, Burke and Hollies have even more reason to want me gone. Or silenced permanently," Ben added grimly. "They spent the day securing the property as best they could." Ben checked and cleaned his weapons while Grace organized her medical supplies, preparing for whatever might come. By mid-afternoon, Sheriff Ellis rode up to the cabin, his expression grave. "Mrs. Renfield," he called from the yard. "We need to talk." Ben stepped onto the porch, hand resting near his gun. "Something wrong, Sheriff?" Ellis dismounted, eyeing Ben warily. "Town council's in an uproar. Someone broke into the mine office last night during the storm. Papers were taken, records, accounts, that sort of thing." Grace emerged from the cabin. "And you think I had something to do with that? I was here all night, as Mr. Dawson can attest." A knowing look crossed Ellis's face. "Yes, I'm sure he can, which raises other questions about propriety, madam." "We're not concerned with gossip, Sheriff," Ben cut in. "Why would anyone think Grace was involved in a burglary?" Ellis removed his hat, wiping sweat from his brow. "Because the papers that were taken include medical records, cases of sickness among the miners over the past year. Records that might interest someone trying to prove the mine is unsafe." Ben and Grace exchanged a quick glance, both realizing the implications. Someone else in town had similar suspicions about the source of the fever. "I know nothing about any break-in," Grace stated firmly, "though I fail to see how medical records would be considered sensitive enough to warrant your concern." Ellis replaced his hat. "Burke is offering a reward for information. Thought you should know given your situation." He looked pointedly at Ben. "Some folks are saying you might have been involved, Dawson, you being a stranger who showed up right before trouble started." "I was here during the storm," Ben replied evenly. "As the lady said." The sheriff nodded slowly. "So you were. Well, consider yourselves warned. Things are getting tense in town." He mounted his horse. "By the way, Reverend Hollies is holding a town meeting tonight. Might be in your interests to attend, both of you." After Ellis departed, Grace turned to Ben, concern evident in her eyes. "Someone else is investigating the mine connection. Question is, are they an ally or just another complication?" Ben mused. "Either way, we should attend that meeting. Better to know what we're facing." Grace hesitated. "It could be a trap, getting us both into town away from the cabin." "Possibly," Ben acknowledged, "but we can't hide out here forever. And if Hollies is planning to turn the town against you officially, we need to be there to counter it." As dusk approached, they rode into Hachita together, Ben's rifle across his saddle and his Colt at his hip. Grace had changed into her best remaining dress, her copper hair neatly arranged beneath a modest bonnet. Despite her circumstances, she carried herself with quiet dignity that struck Ben anew. The town meeting was being held in the church, a simple wooden structure that was the largest building in Hachita. As they approached, Ben noted that nearly every resident appeared to be present, their horses and wagons crowding the hitching posts. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Conversations stopped as Ben and Grace entered, hostile eyes following their progress to a bench at the back. Reverend Holly stood at the pulpit, with Burke, Miller, and other prominent citizens seated in the front row. "Courage," Ben murmured to Grace as they sat down. Holly's cleared his throat, bringing the meeting to order. "Friends, neighbors, we face a crisis in our community. Not only has our town been plagued by unexplained deaths, but now criminal elements seek to undermine the very industry that sustains us all." Murmurs rippled through the congregation. Holly's continued, his voice rising with practiced oratory. "The mining records stolen last night contained sensitive information about our operations information that in the wrong hands could lead to unwarranted scrutiny from territorial authorities. What's in those records that you're so afraid of, Reverend?" The question came from an unexpected source, Howard Jenkins, a shopkeeper who'd previously been one of Grace's most vocal critics. Holly's faltered momentarily. "That's not the point, Mr. Jenkins. The point is that property has been stolen, and we have reason to believe it's connected to attempts to slander our town's primary industry." Jenkins stood. "My son works in that mine. If there's something in those records about illnesses, I think we have a right to know." "Sit down, Jenkins," Burke commanded from his seat. "This isn't about your boy, isn't it?" Jenkins persisted. "3 men dead from some mysterious fever, all connected to the mine, and now someone steals medical records. Seems mighty coincidental." The crowd grew restless, some nodding in agreement with Jenkins. Ben watched carefully, sensing a shift in the room. Holly's attempted to regain control. "We are here to discuss the presence of dangerous elements in our community, specifically those who have brought nothing but misfortune since their arrival." He pointed dramatically at Grace. "Mrs. Renfield has been tolerated long enough. Her unnatural practices and her defiance of proper authority cannot continue." Ben felt Grace stiffen beside him, but she remained seated, her expression composed. "And what authority would that be, Reverend?" came another voice from the crowd. Eleanor Hayes, the elderly widow of the doctor who had died, rose shakily to her feet. "My husband served this community for 30 years. In his personal papers, which you did not manage to steal, he noted his concerns about lung ailments among the miners. Ailments that Mr. Burke insisted were not connected to his operations." The meeting erupted into chaos, accusations flying. Ben noticed Sheriff Ellis slipping out the back door as the confrontation escalated. Suddenly, Burke stood and fired his pistol into the air, splintering the wooden ceiling. The room fell silent. "Enough," he roared. "This meeting is about the witch and her gunman, not about business matters that don't concern you." "My husband's death concerns me, Mrs. Hayes replied with remarkable calm. "And if he died from a disease caused by conditions in your mind, conditions you concealed, then Grace Renfield is owed an apology by this entire town." Burke's face contorted with rage. "You old fool. Your husband died because he was past his prime and meddling in affairs beyond his expertise." "That's a lie." Grace spoke for the first time, rising to her feet. All eyes turned to her. Dr. Hayes recognized the symptoms as similar to ones he'd seen in miners years ago. He called it mine fever, caused by some mineral or gas released during excavation. Her voice gained strength as she continued. "He was documenting cases, building evidence. That's what you feared was in those stolen records, isn't it, Mr. Burke? Proof that you knew the mine was making workers sick but continued operations anyway." Burke's hand moved to his gun, but Ben was faster, his Colt appearing as if by magic. "I wouldn't," he advised quietly. The standoff was broken by a commotion at the church door. Sheriff Ellis returned, accompanied by a tall man in a dust coat, a federal marshal's badge glinting on his chest. "Evening, folks," the newcomer drawled. "Marshal John Wentworth, seems I arrived at an interesting time." Burke slowly lowered his hand from his gun. "This is a private town matter, Marshal, nothing that concerns federal authorities." Wentworth removed his hat, revealing graying hair and a weathered face. "Well now, that depends. Sheriff Ellis here telegraphed about a break-in and some missing documents. But on my ride in, I encountered a very interesting fellow on the Silver City Road mining inspector from the territorial capital, carrying what appeared to be the missing papers." A stunned silence fell over the church. "Interesting reading, those records," Wentworth continued casually. "Shows a pattern of illness among miners dating back 18 months. Shows complaints ignored, symptoms documented, and most interestingly, shows knowledge of the risks by the ownership." He fixed Burke with a steely gaze. "That's criminal negligence, Mr. Burke. Not to mention the subsequent effort to intimidate witnesses and create a scapegoat." Grace stepped forward. "You know about that," the marshal nodded. "Inspector Mitchell was quite thorough, been investigating quietly for months, ever since Dr. Hayes contacted him with initial concerns. The good doctor may have died from this mine fever, but he made sure his evidence wouldn't die with him." Reverend Hollies sputtered from the pulpit. "This is preposterous. You can't possibly believe." "Save it, Reverend," Wentworth cut him off. "I've got sworn statements from 3 miners who recovered from mild cases of the fever, all testifying that Mrs. Renfield's treatments likely saved their lives, while the mine owners discouraged them from seeking help." The townspeople began to murmur again, this time with a different tenor. Ben watched as realization dawned on faces throughout the room, the gradual, uncomfortable acceptance that they had been manipulated into persecuting an innocent woman. "Marshal," Burke began, adopting a conciliatory tone, "there's clearly been a misunderstanding. If there are safety concerns at the mine, we'll address them immediately. But suggesting some kind of conspiracy is exactly what the evidence suggests," Wentworth finished for him. "Sheriff Ellis, I'm placing Mr. Burke under arrest for criminal negligence resulting in death, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit intimidation." He turned to Hollies. "You'll be coming along too, Reverend. The territorial prosecutor is particularly interested in your role in all this." As Ellis reluctantly moved to carry out the arrests, the church erupted again, some protesting, others demanding more information about the mine's safety. Ben took Grace's elbow, guiding her toward the door. "Let's get you out of here," he murmured. "This could get ugly." Outside, the night air was cool and clear, a stark contrast to the heated atmosphere inside. Grace drew a deep breath, trembling slightly under Ben's hand. "It's over," she said, disbelief coloring her voice. "All this time, Dr. Hayes was building a case. He never believed I was responsible." "He knew the truth," Ben replied, "and made sure it would come out eventually." They mounted their horses and rode slowly back toward Grace's cabin, the church behind them still in uproar. As they reached the creek crossing, Grace reined in her mare. "What happens now?" she asked, her face pale in the moonlight. "The truth may be known, but that doesn't erase months of hatred and fear. Those people drove me out of their lives long before tonight." Ben considered her words carefully. "People can change when faced with the truth. Some will come around, apologize. Others never will." He paused. "Question is, do you want to stay and find out?" Grace looked back toward the town, then at Ben. "Are you asking if I want to leave Hachita?" "I'm asking what you want, period," he replied. "Now that your name is cleared, you have choices. You could stay here, rebuild your practice, or you could start fresh somewhere else." He hesitated, then added softly, "Either way, I'd be honored to remain at your side if you'll have me." The words hung between them, the declaration Ben had been building toward for weeks finally spoken. Grace's eyes widened slightly, then softened with an emotion he dared not name. "Benjamin Dawson," she said, a small smile playing at her lips, "are you offering to court the Witch of Hachita?" "I'm offering to court Grace Renfield," he corrected gently. The bravest, most principled woman I've ever known. What happened these past months, it revealed the character of everyone involved, yours most of all. Grace urged her horse closer to his, close enough that their knees touched. I haven't given much thought to the future beyond survival, she admitted. But I know I don't want to face it without you. She reached out, her hand finding his. I think I've been falling in love with you since you stopped those stones from hitting me. No one has ever stood up for me the way you have. Ben entwined his fingers with hers, his heart fuller than he could remember it being in years. Then we'll face whatever comes together. He looked toward her cabin, visible in the distance. For tonight, let's go home. Tomorrow we can decide where home will be after that. They rode the rest of the way hand in hand, the stars overhead bearing witness to a bond forged in adversity and strengthened by truth finally revealed. The days following the dramatic town meeting brought swift changes to Hachita. Burke and Hollies were transported to Silver City to await trial. The mine was temporarily closed pending a safety investigation, and the mood in town shifted palpably as residents grappled with their collective culpability in Grace's persecution. Some, like Howard Jenkins and Alina Hayes, came to the cabin to offer explicit apologies and tentative overtures of friendship. Others maintained their distance, but no longer expressed open hostility. A few, including the blacksmith Miller, remained convinced that Grace had somehow engineered the entire situation to her advantage. Marshal Wentworth stayed in town for a week, overseeing the initial stages of the investigation and ensuring Grace's safety. Before departing, he visited the cabin one last time. Mrs. Renfield, he said, standing hat in hand in her small front room, the territorial governor has taken a personal interest in your case. He wishes to express his regret for what you endured and offers compensation for damages to your property. Grace, who sat beside Ben at her table, shook her head. I don't want compensation, Marshal. I want assurance that the miners who fell ill will receive proper care and that safety measures will be implemented before the mine reopens. Wentworth nodded approvingly. Already in progress, Inspector Mitchell will remain to oversee those changes. He glanced at Ben. Dawson, your actions in standing by Mrs. Renfield when others wouldn't have been noted. There might be a position available with the territorial authorities if you're interested. Good men are hard to find. Ben's hand found Grace's under the table. Appreciate the offer, Marshal, but I've made other commitments. After Wentworth departed, Grace turned to Ben, her eyes questioning. You turned down a job opportunity, for me, for us, he corrected. Besides, I'm not sure a badge is what I want anymore. He hesitated. Unless you'd prefer to stay in Hachita. With your name cleared, you could rebuild your practice here. Grace considered this, looking around the small cabin that had been both prison and sanctuary. There are too many painful memories here, she finally said. Too much blood spilled, too many bitter words spoken. I think a fresh start would be best. Where would you like to go? Ben asked. A smile bloomed across Grace's face. You once mentioned a small ranch you worked on near Austin. You said it was peaceful there. Ben's eyebrows rose in surprise. You remembered that. I remember everything you've told me, she replied softly. About the lives you've lived, the places you've seen. That ranch sounded like somewhere a person could put down roots. It's available, Ben confirmed. Owner wrote me last month offering to sell. Said he was getting too old for the work and his children had moved east. He hadn't mentioned the letter to Grace, not wanting to pressure her with possibilities when her situation was so precarious. Could we make a life there? Grace asked. You ranching, me perhaps practicing medicine for the surrounding farms? The vision she painted settled into Ben's heart like it had always belonged there. We could, he agreed. It wouldn't be easy at first, but between your knowledge and my experience, I reckon we'd manage. The decision made, they began preparations to leave Hachita. Word spread quickly, and to Grace's surprise, many townspeople expressed genuine regret at her departure. The newspaper published a formal retraction of previous articles that had implied her guilt in the fever deaths, and Sheriff Ellis, chastened by the marshal's intervention, ensured the remaining days of her residence were peaceful. On their final evening in the cabin, Ben arrived with a small box in his hand and uncharacteristic nervousness in his demeanor. "I've been thinking," he began, setting the box on the table between them. "We've talked about starting a new life together, but we haven't discussed exactly what that means." Grace looked at the box, then at Ben, understanding dawning in her eyes. "Benjamin." He opened the box, revealing a simple silver ring with a small emerald that matched her eyes. "I'm not a man of fancy words or grand gestures," he said, "but I know that finding you was the best thing that ever happened to me, even if it came in the worst circumstances." He took her hand. "Grace Renfield, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears filled Grace's eyes as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." The following morning, before their departure, they stood before Justice of the Peace William Taylor with Alina Hayes and Howard Jenkins as witnesses. The ceremony was brief and unadorned, but as they exchanged vows, Ben felt a sense of rightness that had eluded him throughout his wandering years. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Taylor concluded. "May your new beginning be blessed." As they rode out of Hachita, Grace in the wagon with their combined possessions, Ben on horseback beside her, they passed the cemetery where James Renfield was buried. Grace had visited the grave one last time at dawn, saying a private farewell to the man who had brought her west. "Any regrets?" Ben asked as they reached the edge of town. Grace looked back at the cluster of buildings that had been the site of so much pain and ultimately vindication. "No," she said with certainty. "What happened here shaped me, but it doesn't define us." The journey to Texas took several weeks, the changing landscape marking their progress eastward. They traveled at a leisurely pace, getting to know each other in this new context, no longer protector and protected, but partners in a shared future. When they finally arrived at the ranch outside Austin, it was early October. The modest house stood on a rise overlooking rolling pastures, a barn and corrals where cattle grazed in the distance. It wasn't grand, but it was solid and well-maintained with good water and fertile land. "What do you think?" Ben asked as they stopped the wagon in the yard. "Is it what you imagined?" Grace surveyed her new home, taking in the oak trees surrounding the house, the garden space beside it, the distant hills beyond. "It's perfect," she declared. "Room to grow, room to heal." The previous owner had left most of the furnishings, making the transition easier. By nightfall, they had settled in enough to share their first meal in their new home. Sitting across from his wife, the words still new and wonderful to him, Ben raised his cup in a toast. "To new beginnings," he said. Grace raised her own cup. "And to the end of being shunned," she added with a smile. They settled into their new lives with surprising ease. Ben took to ranching as if he'd been born to it, his knowledge of horses and cattle serving him well as he built up their small herd. Grace, meanwhile, slowly established herself as a healer in the community, her skills filling a need in the rural area where doctors were scarce. At first, she was cautious about revealing the extent of her knowledge, mindful of her experience in Hachita. But the people of the area proved more practical than superstitious, more concerned with results than with questioning a woman's abilities. "Mrs. Jenkins' baby came early," she told Ben one evening in December, warming herself by the fire after a long day attending the birth. "But mother and child are doing well. That's the third delivery this month." Ben smiled at her from his chair where he was mending a bridle. "Word travels fast when someone knows what they're doing. You're building quite a reputation." "A good one this time," Grace noted. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. As winter settled over their new home, they found themselves hosting Christmas dinner for neighbors who had quickly become friends. The house was filled with warmth, laughter, and the smells of holiday, cooking, a stark contrast to the isolation Grace had endured the previous winter. "You've changed this place." Ben observed late that night after their guests had departed. They stood on the porch, watching snow begin to fall in the moonlight. Brought it to life. Grace leaned against him, his arm around her shoulders keeping her warm against the December chill. "We both did," she corrected. "I never imagined I could be this happy again, especially after everything in Hachita." Ben pressed a kiss to her temple. "You know, I received a letter from Alina Hayes yesterday. She said something interesting." "Oh," Grace looked up at him curiously. "She said your name is spoken with reverence in Hachita now. The mine has reopened with new safety measures, and several cases of the fever have been successfully treated using your documented methods." He smiled. "Apparently, the new doctor keeps a journal you started, with all your observations about symptoms and treatments." Grace absorbed this information with a mixture of emotions. "It's strange to think of being remembered that way, in a place where I was once so hated." "Truth has a way of prevailing," Ben said, drawing her closer. "You stood your ground when it would have been easier to run. That kind of courage leaves a mark." They fell silent, watching the snowflakes dance in the light spilling from their windows. The future stretched before them, full of possibilities neither could have imagined when they first met in that dusty street, a former Texas Ranger who had lost his way and a widow accused of witchcraft, both outcasts who had found belonging in each other. "Come inside, Mrs. Dawson," Ben said eventually. "It's getting cold and tomorrow comes early." Grace smiled at the name that still felt new and wonderful. "In a minute. I want to remember this moment, our first winter together in our own home." The snow continued to fall, covering the land in a blanket of white that promised renewal with the coming spring. Inside the warmth of their home, two people who had found each other against all odds prepared to face whatever the future might bring together. As the years passed, the ranch prospered under their care. Ben's natural affinity for horses led to breeding stock that became sought after throughout the region, while Grace's medical practice expanded to include not only the surrounding farms but travelers passing through on their way west. By their 5th anniversary, the house had been expanded to include a proper examination room for Grace's patients and a nursery for their son, James Benjamin Dawson, born in the spring of their 3rd year of marriage. He was joined 2 years later by his sister, Alina Marie, named for the woman in Hachita who had stood by Grace when few others would. Word of Dr. Grace, as she came to be known despite her lack of formal credentials, spread throughout Central Texas. Her specialized knowledge of illnesses related to mining and frontier conditions brought patients from considerable distances, and her success rate earned her the respect of even traditionally trained physicians. Ben, watching his wife flourish, sometimes marveled at how different their life had become from those tense days in Hachita. The woman who had been shunned and feared now commanded respect and affection from an ever-widening circle. The former lawman who had lost faith in justice had found purpose in building a legacy for their children. "Penny for your thoughts," Grace said one evening, finding him on the porch watching the sunset. At 33, she had grown even more beautiful to him, confidence and happiness having softened the wariness that once characterized her expression. "Just thinking about how far we've come," he replied, making room for her on the bench beside him. "Got a letter from Marshal Wentworth today. Burke died in prison last month." Grace absorbed this news quietly. "I can't say I'm sorry, but I don't feel the satisfaction I once thought I would." She leaned her head against Ben's shoulder. "It seems very far away now, doesn't it? Almost like it happened to different people." "In a way it did," Ben agreed. "We're not who we were then." Inside the house, they could hear Alina's laughter as she played with her brother under the watchful eye of Rosa, the local woman who helped with the children when Grace was attending patients. The sounds of their family, a reality that once seemed impossible, filled both with profound gratitude. As dusk deepened into night, Ben took Grace's hand. The simple band he'd placed there years ago now joined by another ring, this one set with small diamonds he'd purchased to mark the birth of their son. "Any regrets?" he asked, echoing the question he'd posed as they left Hachita. Grace turned to face him, her green eyes reflecting the last light of day. "Not one," she answered with certainty. "Every step, even the painful ones, led us here." She leaned forward to kiss him, the gesture as natural as breathing after years together, yet still carrying the spark that had first kindled between them in the most unlikely circumstances. Inside, their children called for them, eager for the bedtime stories that had become a cherished ritual. Ben and Grace rose together, hands still linked, and went to them, moving from the fading light of day into the warmth of the home they had built, not just with timber and nails, but with courage, perseverance, and a love that had transformed them both. The woman once shunned by all now stood at the center of a life filled with purpose and connection. Her name indeed whispered with reverence not just in Hachita, but wherever people spoke of healing, courage, and the power of truth to overcome even the darkest prejudice. And beside her always was the man who had seen her value when others saw only fear, the former ranger, who had found his true north in the eyes of a copper-haired healer on a dusty street in a town that had tried and failed to break her spirit. Together, they had written a story far more powerful than the ones that had nearly destroyed them, a story of redemption, of second chances, and of love that flourishes most beautifully in the places where it seems least likely to take root.